Awesome. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I hope you've had fun at PuppetConf so far. We are going to talk about how to get you guys to the latest version of Puppet, and this is going to be kind of a crash course on sort of the infrastructure that you'll need to get there and the methodology that we want you to go through to test your code and safely be able to land on Puppet 4. As Jesse mentioned, my name's Elizabeth Wittig Plumb, and I'm a technical account manager at Puppet.
My name's Nate McCurdy. I'm a professional services engineer at Puppet.
We're going to try to go fast enough to leave time for questions at the end, but it might be a little iffy, so yeah. We'll see how it goes.
Hey.
Do you have the...
Awesome. Okay. It's clear, just decided to stop working all of a sudden. All right, so this talk is going to be broken down into 4 sections. First, why you should upgrade. If you're still on the fence about sticking to your Puppet 2 or Puppet 3 infrastructure, maybe think about upgrading. We're going to give you some reasons why that would be a good idea. And then what you need. So this is going to involve a little bit of tooling and workflow, and we're going to show you both of those things. And then we're going to walk you through the process to use that tooling. And it's a process that we've used in professional services for a lot of our customers with some pretty good success. So we just wanted to share it with you. And then some gotchas about the upgrade process, just kind of random one-off things that didn't really fit anywhere else. OK, so why should I upgrade? This may be you on the left. Maybe you're in Puppet 2 or Puppet 3 world right now. And things might be working, but trust me, it's a little greener on the Puppet 4 side of things. There's a lot of good features that have been released. I'm sure some of you have seen a lot of them at PuppetConf so far. For example, there's been a lot of language features that have been added. We're going to just go over a few of them really briefly. This is not a talk on Puppet 4. This is on how to get you to Puppet 4. So first of all, there's iteration. You can get rid of create resources finally and start using proper iteration. The type system is going to introduce a lot of really cool, powerful things you can do. Validate your parameters in the classes. With the type system and with class parameters, there's some things coming out in Puppet Enterprise in the near future where, let's say you use the enum type in your parameter and specify a possible list of values. Once you have that in your code, the idea is to then have in the console drop-down box show you exactly all the possible options. There's going to be a lot more integration with the type system in the console and with the orchestrator and other things like that. So if you start using it, you can kind of future-proof yourself for those cool new things. And then you just get kind of cleaner Puppet code, of course.
A couple of other things to point out. We have the new all-in-one agent packaging. So a lot of our customers that are using Puppet Enterprise have some of their nodes running open source, some are running enterprise. Now that it's one agent, it's really easy to sort of, if you decide to go the enterprise route, point those open source nodes over to your enterprise infrastructure. We have a ton of new features in Puppet Enterprise. 2016.4 is the latest version we just announced yesterday. Some of those features include the orchestrator, using the orchestrator to do a direct change workflow. Puppet DBHA that Zach Smith is going to be talking about, actually, I think right after this talk. But in general, there's just a ton of stability and scalability improvements in Puppet 4. So in terms of what the Puppet server can handle, the Puppet console, I work with a lot of customers with really big infrastructures, and they're able to scale those infrastructures much more easily today than you could in the 3 series. But the biggest reason that we want you to go, if you need more of a stick than a carrot, is that PE 3.8 is end of life on December 31st. So if you're in the process of upgrading after December 31st and you're a PE customer, support will still help you as long as you're in the process of upgrading. But if you open a ticket on something that's broken in 3.2 or 3.8, that will no longer be supported. The good news is we've just announced 2016.4, which is our new long-term supported release, and that's going to be supported for the next 24 months for those customers that kind of require a little more lead time to be able to upgrade. Of course, we'll still be coming out with regular sort of, quarterly releases, so you can keep up with new features and things, but the LTS is designed for those customers that need a little more time to upgrade. We'll be putting bug fixes and security updates into the 2016 4 LTS for the next 24 months or so.
So as part of the LTS release, we also released upgrade services in professional services and a whole upgrade section in our doc site. So if you look on our doc site, docs.puppet.com/upgrade, you'll see a workflow described in one of those sections, and that's pretty much what we're showing you here as well. Something designed in the field and formalized and standardized. Okay. Now, the reason we're giving you that workflow is because there are some changes to be aware of in Puppet 4, right? So you can't just install Puppet 4 and think everything's going to be exactly the same, because it's not. Sorry. Some kind of classes of the changes here that we're going to just lightly cover. First of all, obviously, code changes. With a new parser comes a new way to parse your code. For example, that's a good intro, thanks. For example, empty string is now true. Other code changes like that. Your file modes must be quoted. How we handle strings and integers is changing. We now factor doesn't stringify facts anymore. So if you relied on your facts being strings, it's probably now structured data. So things to be aware of there. If any of you wrote custom facts, the factor API has changed in the latest release. So some of your custom facts might not work as intended. And then also with the all-in-one packaging and with some other changes we made, there are directories that are now different. Obviously, Etsy Puppet is now Etsy Puppet Labs. If you have any custom tooling or scripting around either like deploying code or parsing manifests on disk to do something, which, why are you doing that? Those paths are now different, so you're going to have to update all those scripts.
So we've also made some classification changes. So the classifier actually changed. The big change was in 3.7, but Puppet now has uses directory environments by default. And there's also sort of a separation between two different types of what we call node groups. So we now have environment groups and classification groups. So the environment group sets which environment that group of nodes is talking to, and we'll talk a little bit more about environments and what that means in terms of your code on disk in a couple of slides. And the default node groups that ship with PE have changed a little bit, so keep an eye out for that. Also, if you use the import function, if you use that in Puppet 3, that is no longer part of the product, so keep that in mind. And then console changes. We have sort of been able to massively scale the console to a degree that we couldn't in Puppet 3. It also has a new hierarchy of node groups in the latest version that just came out yesterday. So if any of you guys are using or have played around with Puppet 4 and looked at the PE console, before we just sort of had a static list of all of your node groups all in order, and you couldn't really see how those were related to each other, what was a parent, what was a child. So in this latest version, you can actually see the nested, that hierarchy of those node groups, which makes a huge difference. Anything else I should mention here? Nope.
Yeah.
Good.
And then also, so if you're interested in some of these changes, especially the code changes, this doc site has a very full list of changes that you can search through. All right. Okay, so you know you want to upgrade. How do you start doing it? You could just do an in-place upgrade your existing masters, but that's not really recommended. What we recommend doing is standing up a new infrastructure, new Puppet masters on the latest version, and then fixing your code up and migrating your nodes over to that new set of masters or master in a very careful and kind of planned out migration process. And so, by the way, this is for if you have really complex infrastructure, a lot of nodes, hundreds, thousands of nodes, a migration is going to be easier. If you have a small environment, a few dozen nodes, maybe you can just kind of point them over, and that's fine. But when you have dozens of modules, thousands of lines of code, it's not that easy. And the migration really helps with that. Also, it's kind of safer, right? You can migrate to this new infrastructure, and you don't touch your existing production infrastructure. So if something goes wrong in the migration, you can just go back to the old one, and everything's still there. Okay. Eventually, too, once you have these two infrastructures in place, the latest one and the old one, you can kind of do some A/B testing between the two and see what's going to change. And that A/B testing workflow is kind of basically what we're going to show you here coming up very soon. So yes, this may mean you have to spin up, double your Puppet masters, so spin up some extra servers. But that little bit of extra legwork is definitely going to pay off in the end, and we highly recommend it.
All right, so hopefully now you're totally convinced and ready to upgrade. Now we're going to kind of cover what do you need to upgrade. This is going to talk about the environments that we want you to stand up sort of from the infrastructure side, and then the tooling that we have available to let you test your code and kind of talk through what that looks like, how to set it up, and what that tooling is going to show you. Oh, it works.
Started working.
All right, so you're going to need two environments, basically a preview box. This preview box is going to be, it can be a Vagrant environment, something running on your laptop if you have a small number of nodes. Nate's going to talk about that a little bit. But this is going to have Puppet 3.8 running on it, and the Puppet preview tool that is actually available on our Forge. We have a link in a couple of slides that's going to compare how Puppet would parse your catalogs in Puppet 3 versus Puppet 4. So it's really important that once you get that preview tool onto that box that you make sure that it's using that new parser. Otherwise, you're just comparing the same catalog. And even if you already are running 3.8 in your current infrastructure, it's still a good idea to stand up this preview box because you're running these tests in isolation. So that way you're not impacting any of your nodes that are running today. You're just able to test the code on this preview box and kind of leave everything until you're ready to actually start making changes and moving things over. You'll also want to stand up your new PE infrastructure. So as Nate mentioned, we sort of recommend migrating instead of the in-place upgrade. So this workflow we're talking through is sort of with assuming that you're going to migrate and not upgrade. So if you are doing that, we're going to need you to stand up your new PE infrastructure because that's sort of the tail end of the testing process is pointing over at that new infrastructure. Make sure you take into account, how you need to sort of beef up that machine. You can look at our system requirements on docs.puppet.com to make sure that it's ready to receive all of your agents in the future.
Just one note on that, too. The reason we recommend Puppet 3.8 as the catalog preview box, and I should clarify that, we don't recommend it, it's required. You have to have 3.8 on your catalog box if you're moving from pre-3 series to 4. Because the Puppet 3.8 parser is able to compile in both the old legacy parser and the future parser at the same time. After 3.8, it's only in the future parser, so you can't do that comparison. Okay, so 3.8's the latest one that you're able to do that. Okay, so what is a preview box? What does this thing actually do? It's a Puppet master running 3.8, like I mentioned. It can be Puppet Enterprise. Like I said, I have a Vagrant environment that will spin all this up, and I'll show that to you at the end if we have time. But that box also has this catalog preview tool. It's available from the Forge. It kind of ships as a Puppet module, and it adds an extra command to Puppet called Puppet Preview, and that's what does the actual compilation and comparison. Okay, so when it's doing this, it's compiling a catalog in both the old and the new parser. And it shows you the differences between them or any inconsistencies between them. That gives you a really fast feedback loop. It takes, as long as it takes to compile a catalog, that's how long it takes you to get feedback back. And it's sometimes, that could be really fast or a minute or two. This is compiling on the preview box itself, not on your other Puppet masters. So you're not going to interrupt your production infrastructure or even your dev or your test infrastructure. This is a separate, isolated machine. You can compile multiple nodes at a time, or catalogs for multiple nodes at a time, dozens, hundreds, thousands. I've scaled this up to compiling, infrastructures of thousands of nodes and just running a compilation across that entire infrastructure on the one preview box to generate a huge set of differences to start working on. And like I said, so it's able to use the old parser and the new parser to compare these things. That's really where the magic is happening. And so why guess? We're doing this because we want to take the guesswork out of, hey, let's just upgrade and point it to the new infrastructure and see what happens. All right? That's not really a good approach to take to this. Unless, of course, like I said, unless you are kind of a smaller shop with maybe just a dozen or so nodes, that may work for you, okay? But thousands of nodes, hundreds of nodes, don't take that risk. Okay.
All right, so the preview tool identifies two different types of issues. There's migration warnings that it shows you that are showing differences in the way that Puppet compiled your catalog in Puppet 3 versus Puppet 4. And then there's actually differences between the catalogs. So a resource that existed in the Puppet 3 catalog that doesn't exist in Puppet 4. So you want to keep an eye out for those two. And the preview tool generates a report that shows you these differences in migration warnings. The migration warnings have names and IDs. We have a module on the Forge that shows you the preview tool, and it has a whole list of all the different migration warnings and sort of examples of code that can trigger those, so keep an eye out for that. There's a couple different outputs that you can get from the preview tool. So this one is showing that very last flag, that view flag is pointing to the overview output. So let's go to the next slide. And here's a couple different options. There's a summary output, which kind of just shows you a tally of, here's the number of nodes we ran this against, here's the number of failed changes, but just kind of a general overview. The diff view shows you, here's some differences that we noticed, and it points to the line number in the manifest that actually sort of defined that particular resource, sort of like Puppet reports do already. And then the overview view will show you kind of an expanded view of the summary. So the summary just gives you, a tally of here's the number of changes and failed nodes. The overview will actually dig into, what happened or what changed and show you again where that happened in the code. So Zach Smith, who I think just left, bummer, he wrote a tool to be able to interpret the overview-JSON output and put it into an HTML format that's a lot easier to read and digest. So it's a similar output to the overview, except it's a lot easier to sort of visually identify those changes. And it shows you a snippet of the code that actually caused that change or that defined that particular resource. So you can say, okay, here it's being compiled differently, and here's the code that actually told it to do that. And there's a link to the report at the bottom. Sorry.
Yeah. So this is the thing that converts the JSON output to HTML. This was kind of just made as a proof of concept. I'm just going to flip back one slide. One of these views is overview-JSON, and that will output just a giant JSON blob of similar to what this has, but way more information. So you can write some custom tooling that consumes that JSON and generates a fancier human-readable report, this is kind of a proof of concept of doing that. So some of the migration warnings that this tool is really good at showing you are these three right here. There are about 10 or a dozen or so, and those are documented on the tool's README in GitHub and on the Forge. But I just wanted to highlight some commonly seen ones. First of all, migrate for UC bare word is type. What that means is, with the new type system, any bare string or unquoted string that starts with a capital letter in your Puppet code is now considered a type, a Puppet type. Okay? So when the Puppet parser hits that in your manifests, it's going to assume you mean to instantiate this type, which you likely don't actually mean to do. So where I see this pop up most frequently is in selectors or case statements. If you are matching on the OS family fact, the output of that fact starts with a capital letter. So when you have something like this, quote the word Red Hat, quote the word Debian, and then you are now protected from that. Okay. Excuse me?
So he asked, how would you know to do that?
Yeah, the question was, how to know to do that. Yeah, if in the error message that you would see in Puppet 4, you would see red hat with a capital R, unknown type, something similar to that error message. And it would tell you where in the code that was found. And so to answer your question, that's exactly why this tool is made, to help you catch these errors, because some of these you're just not going to know unless you are kind of deep into Puppet. So that's exactly why the catalog preview tool was made, was to help you find these before they affect you in production. All right, and then equality type mismatch. Now in Puppet 4, if you compare a string to a bare number, it's not going to do what you think it's going to do. In Puppet 3, if you compared the string 1 to the number 1 to check equality, it would return true. In Puppet 4, it's going to return false. The string 1 compared with the less than or equal to operator, it's going to error out in Puppet 4. It's going to halt compilation. In Puppet 3, it's going to return true. Okay? So finding these early will fix a lot of odd issues down the line. And then review in expression. Anyone here use the in operator in any of their code? Yeah, a few of us. It's one of my favorite operators. In Puppet 3, it was really good for seeing if a string was in an array. That's how I tend to use it most often. But if that string you're comparing, the left side of the operand, the left operand right there, if that resolves to undef, in Puppet 4, you're going to get a compilation error. I think the message is left operand cannot be undef. In Puppet 3, this would just return false, because that undef is not in the array. So the in operator was kind of loosely defined in Puppet 3. It did things we didn't intend it to do. Some people ended up taking advantage of that and using those things we didn't intend it to do. We have tightened up what it can do, and this check will check for those things. Okay, so these are 3 common ones, but by far the most prevalent one, the one that might affect you in more places than you think, is migrate for empty string true. So in Puppet 4, the empty string is now considered true. In Puppet 3, it was considered false. The catalog preview tool is able to parse your code and find these problems for you before they affect your code. So if you have a class like this, and this is running an exec, that's pretty normal exec everyone would run. If that string is true, so in Puppet 3, this would not destroy your server. In Puppet 4, this is going to destroy your server. Anyone have code like this? Good. You have bigger problems if you're writing code like this. Okay. A couple other notes on the catalog preview tool. Some of the reports it generates can be rather lengthy, and the results are not always really relevant to what you care about. You are able to exclude a whole class of resources and resource type and title pairs. So if you create a JSON file, there's a schema for this JSON blob available on the README, and pass it into the -- excludes, it'll just ignore those resource types. Okay. So one of the things the preview tool finds is bare numbers and strings might show up being converted from bare number to a string, or string to a bare number. That ends up just being kind of noise and not really useful. Sometimes your code doesn't actually matter if a string gets converted to a number or if a number gets converted to a string. I know there's some modules in the Forge that you can pass a bare number or a string, and it just always does the right thing. Right? It has some internal validation. So if you don't care about that in your report, you can hide that with the no-diff string numeric. And then also the no-diff array value in the Puppet 4 parser, when it's compiling the catalog, some parameters, if it's a single element parameter, a parameter with a single string as a value, internally in the catalog, that'll be cast to an array with a single string inside of it. And that's just happening inside the catalog. When it comes to catalog application, it doesn't actually affect anything, but that's going to show up in the report. So you can hide those with no-diff array value. I think there's a, flipping back here.
It's in the...
Sorry, flip it. Like this right here. So that string groups gets converted to an array of a string. It doesn't actually matter, doesn't change anything, but you could hide that with no diff array value. Okay.
Okay, so now we've kind of given you an overview of the tooling you need, the environments you need to stand up, what that tooling is going to show you, and now we're going to walk you through the actual workflow of how you test your code safely and kind of find these differences and change your code to work in Puppet 4. So before we do that, Nate's going to talk really quickly about sort of a very important concept that makes all of this work together. So if you guys aren't familiar with this, then.
So in one slide, I'm going to attempt to explain directory environments and how RTNK works. Basically, on your Puppet master, you're able to have multiple environments. Okay? And each of those environments is a directory on disk in the environment path. Now, if you're using a workflow that fits like RTNK or Code Manager, if you have a control repository, you can have your repository have branches that directly pair up to a directory, to a directory environment. So you'd have a production branch that maps to production environment, a dev branch that maps to dev environment, right? And you're able to work in these environments without affecting the other environments. So we're going to take advantage of that in this workflow. We're going to create a branch off of production in which we're going to start updating code for Puppet 4. And we can do that in isolation from production so you're not going to break production by having like backwards incompatible changes or changing something you shouldn't have. Okay.
All right, so now we're going to walk through all the steps that are necessary. So the first step is setting up those two infrastructures that I talked about earlier, standing up the preview box and standing up your infrastructure. Make sure on that preview box, again, that you have the catalog preview tool installed, and on that catalog preview module that we have on the Forge, there's full instructions on how to install it if you want to stand up your own, or again, you can use the Vagrant environment that we're going to link to at the end that Nate stood up. All right, so once you've got your environments all set up, the first thing you want to do is on your workstation, make sure that you have a local version of your production control repository. And then you're going to create a branch called futureproduction and set the future parser, enable the future parser on that branch in environment.conf. That's what's telling that particular environment to run using the Puppet 4 parser. And again, if you don't make that change, then you're just going to be comparing the exact same catalog to each other.
And then if you aren't using RTNK or don't have a control repo, don't worry, you can still use this workflow. Just manually copy the production environment to future production on the master and create that environment.conf file. Okay, so once you've done that change, I'm assuming you have a control repo from this point forward, but just note that you don't need it. On the catalog preview box, you're then you can configure RTNK to talk to your Git repo and deploy your environments. So when you have production and future production, those two environments will be deployed to your preview box. And then from that point forward, that's going to be so you're going to make your changes locally on your workstation, push them up to Git, and then deploy them to your preview box, and basically repeat that. Okay. So step 4, once you've got your code on the preview box, you can now run the preview tool. So that is Puppet Preview, and there's a few flags here. -- baseline environment is going to be your control environment, basically, the original environment. Typically, that would be production. Then you have -- preview environment. That's going to be the environment in which you are working on, future production, for example. By the way, it doesn't have to be called future production. That's just what we've always done. And then -- migrate 3.8, 4.0. That will turn on the migration warnings. So by adding that flag, it'll show you all those coded kind of IDs of the migration warnings. That's likely what you want if you're moving from 3 to 4. And then -- nodes, you can create a text file that just has a node name per line and pass that into the tool, and it will compile a catalog in the future parser and the old parser for each of those nodes and compare them for you. You can leave off -- nodes and nodes.txt, in which case you would just put the name of a single node at the end of the command, and it'll compile for just that node. And then -- view, like Elizabeth mentioned, there are a bunch of different ways you can see this report. Overview is the one I use most commonly. But if you are going to parse this using some other tool to visualize the data a little bit better, you're going to do overview-JSON. So here I'm just saving it to a file on disk. And then you can use whatever tooling you want, or the tool that we have here, the preview report that converts JSON to HTML.
All right, so step 5 is finding an issue to fix. So once you've run that report, you want to go through and look at what it says. So there's a couple of different things that could come up. The first thing you want to look for is if there's any compilation errors, you want to make sure you take care of those right away. You want to make sure that your catalogs are compiling cleanly, because if you don't take care of those, some of those compilation errors could actually be masking some of those migration warnings that could come up. So make sure that your catalogs are compiling cleanly so that you get a full list of all of the differences that the preview tool noticed between the two. And then once you've got your catalogs compiling cleanly, start with the warnings that are most prevalent, that are sort of most widespread. So it's going to show you, all right, this showed up on all of my nodes, this showed up on 90% of my nodes. Start with those warnings and then kind of work your way down from there. All right, so the next step is actually fixing the issue. So if it's a small issue, maybe it's just adding quotes somewhere, you can do that directly in your future production environment. However, if it's a longer fix, something that would require changing lots of code, maybe a longer refactor or something like that, you'll want to create a new branch off of future production to do that work, take a little bit more time to fix that, and then merge that back in when it's done.
Once you've got that initial fix in place and merged back in, or in future production, you're basically going to repeat that process. You're now going to deploy it one more time on the preview box to bring in that change you just made, and then run the preview tool one more time. That'll generate a new report. You can convert it to HTML if you wish, and then see if that issue is still there. Okay? If it's not, good job. If it's still there, go back and try to keep fixing it. But basically, you're going to loop through that and just rinse and repeat this entire process. Okay? So this is it's not going to use the word tedious, but it's very controlled and methodical, working through your code one issue at a time. Ideally, you're going to fix an issue that's affecting, like 90% of your nodes. You fix that one issue, and then boom, your issue pool has shrunk down to just a few issues, right? So by working on those most prevalent issues first, you can cut off a bunch of them and start lowering what you have to do. All right. Eventually, once you start fixing the issues, what you're going to be left with in the reports are what we consider just kind of noise. These are, like I mentioned, things that don't really affect you, like the single element being converted to an array. You might see them in your report like that, but they're not really needed. So assuming you fix all your legitimate issues, like this one down here, can anyone spot what's different in the bottom one there? What's that? Compress, yeah. So in Puppet 4, all of a sudden your log rotates jobs are not going to be compressed. That's kind of a problem. So once you fix those legitimate issues, you might be left with noise, okay?
I really wanted to use an air horn on this slide, but I didn't get one.
Yeah. I think they would have let us to.
Right?
Yeah. Okay, so you fixed all your issues, you got this noise left, great. What do you do next? Well, there's a problem. Catalog preview only solves part of that problem. All we've been doing so far is compiling catalogs and comparing the catalogs. There's a whole other half to the Puppet story, and that is catalog application. So how is the agent going to apply the catalog to itself, right? That's a whole other suite of problems that catalog preview doesn't catch because it can't. It only knows what the catalog is. Okay? So for example, if you didn't bother to test catalog application, it would be like you get this report, great, it looks really good, like an IKEA kind of catalog. where you see something really nice, looks good on paper, seems to fit, has all the right shelves, everything looks good. But when you go to actually bring it home and set it up, it doesn't quite work so well, right? Like maybe you forgot a screw, maybe it covers a heater vent on your floor and it like lights on fire. Maybe it's got a weird smell and your cat hates it. Like all kinds of things can happen during catalog application, okay?
Yeah, so that's why we need you to test catalog application. And that dude looks just like Zach Smith, so I was hoping that he would be here. It's not him, I don't think, but
I don't think
it really does look like him. Once you've made all those changes, you've fixed everything that you found in the preview tool, you're going to want to point your agents at your new infrastructure and do a no-op run to see if everything's sort of compiling and going to be applied correctly. In order to do that, you're going to have to migrate your CA certs over to that new infrastructure. But once you've done that, you can run a Puppet agent run. So here's sort of the syntax you would want to use for that no-op or simulation run. That -- server flag is saying, here's the new Puppet master that I want to point to. And then the environment is making sure that you're compiling that code from your future production branch where you've made those changes and fixed your code to make it ready for Puppet 4. So once you've done that and everything's working, you've tested it on your new infrastructure, that's when you're ready to start merging all those changes you've made in your future production branch back into production. All right, so there's a couple other things that we want to mention. We've sort of covered the whole workflow, but there's a couple of points we want to point out just so that you're aware of it, but we've sort of covered the big picture, and these are sort of just a couple details we want to mention at the end.
So first, remember, don't worry, this is happening on the preview box. You can compile catalogs for thousands of nodes. That does not affect your agents. It does not affect your production Puppet masters. Okay? This is happening on an isolated preview box. That's why in professional services, I like using this methodology because it's very safe. You know, our customers are very, they trust us to not break production, and this is how we do that. Okay, kind of going back to Puppet 101. At the life cycle of a Puppet run starts with the agent submitting its facts to the Puppet master. Okay? The Puppet master then takes those facts and your Puppet code and compiles a catalog, right? So all you really need for catalog compilation is a list of facts and your code. You don't need the agent at all, as long as you have its facts. So on your catalog preview box, there's two ways to get those facts. Out of the box, all Puppet masters have their terminus, or Puppet enterprise masters, I should say, have their terminus or the place to look up facts set to PuppetDB. So you could query your production PuppetDB server for each of those catalog compilations to retrieve those facts. That doesn't always work. Maybe sometimes you don't have like network connectivity between your preview box and your production PuppetDB. There's any number of reasons why that may not be appropriate. So what you can do is you can instead rely on the fact that your Puppet master caches all of your node's facts in YAML files on disk on the master. So if you switch the master's fax terminus, the catalog previews fax terminus to YAML, that means read the fax cache on disk. So on your production Puppet master, if you do -- config print YAML dir, you'll see this directory with a fax folder and a nodes folder. Inside the fax folder are all these YAML files. Those are the latest list of facts submitted by each of the agents. So you can take those, copy the entire fax folder, move it onto your preview box. Now you have access to all those facts, and you can compile catalogs. Okay? And also, if you do end up, if you have thousands or even hundreds of nodes, you are compiling catalogs for these, so it may take a little while, tens of minutes for thousands of nodes. You can scale that down and get a lot faster feedback loop if you take your list of nodes to compile for and make that just a representative set of your nodes. So if you have 200 web servers and they're all exactly the same, they have the same role, as in roles and profiles, you don't need to compile a catalog for all 200 of them, just one, because it's the same Puppet code, right? So find that representative set of nodes, maybe that's just the list of your roles, and pipe that into the dash dash nodes flag. That'll cut down your feedback loop to a lot faster times. I have a Vagrant environment here. Don't think we're going to get much time to show it to you, but it has a 3.8.6 enterprise master and a 2016-4 enterprise master, and some kind of scripting behind it so that the terminus is set to YAML on the 3.8 box. The catalog preview tool gets installed, and you can go ahead and just start running it right away. I have some example node facts already staged in that Vagrant environment, and there's some code there as well that is broken, that is not Puppet 4 compatible, so you can kind of see what the tool looks like when it runs against bad code. And that's the Vagrant environment right there. Okay.
All right, you did it. You're already there. Are you so happy? So now that you've got your code ready, you've got your agents pointing to the new infrastructure, the last step is upgrading your agents. We have a module to help you do that, the Puppet Agent module on the Forge. We recommend running it for the first time once you upgrade the agent, running it in no-op mode just to make sure everything looks okay. But that's sort of the last step in your upgrade process to make you 100% up to date. Shouldn't take you too long. Some people wait a long time to do this last step. I would recommend just getting it out of the way because otherwise, like, you have to think about upgrading again in the future, and it takes a surprisingly long time to get people to think about it again. So I would do this sooner rather than later.
Yeah. And then, yeah, and that's it. So really, we found that the code is the biggest problem when updating to Puppet 4. If you have lots of code, you have lots of issues to fix. The installation of Puppet Enterprise, the upgrade of the agent, that's much simpler compared to fixing your code. So hopefully, we have taught you a good way to help you do that. Right. And that's it. We've got a few minutes for questions, if anyone would like. There'll be a mic passed around, so it's coming to you. Here you go.
Maybe you have some recommendations for people that heavily rely on PuppetDB. So we have more than 5,000 nodes and rely on monitoring and backups and PuppetDB query module. So maybe you have advices on transferring, migrating data, or just leaving it with all critical nodes disabled. Maybe some advice.
Yeah, so I'll take that. You can, so also remember, the data that's in PuppetDB, it's ephemeral. It'll be recreated the next time the agent checks in. Right? So you have to ask yourself, do you really need that data in PuppetDB? If you do, by the way, that data is reports, facts, catalogs, a couple other random things. If you really need that, which most of the time I find people don't need that to stick around, you can export and import into the new version of PuppetDB. And that's how I've kind of handled that. Another question?
Are there any holes or gotchas if I'm using RSpec to test catalog compilation and I start doing that against version 4 that maybe the catalog preview tool would catch that RSpec wouldn't?
That's a good question. First, you have to make sure your RSpec tests have 100% coverage. Right? That's probably the biggest thing to watch out for. I know, I forgot his name, Rob Nelson did a talk on upgrading, and he has kind of test coverage for a lot of his code. So I recommend watching his presentation if you haven't seen it. He goes over some of the gotchas in that. But the good thing about the catalog preview module is you don't have to write a single line of RSpec, and you can still test all your code. Right. Good question. Up front.
I guess it's a little bit out of scope, but I think it's relevant, is that I can imagine as I go through some of our old modules that there'll be some that are just like hopeless. Mm-hmm. And it seems like the right process there is to go ahead and kind of refactor those in production. I mean, like using our current scheme. And then once that's stable, then try to do the 3 to 4 migration path.
So that depends. Typically the way I've done this workflow, I've been updating for Puppet 4 compatibility first and then refactoring for best practices second. But it depends on how much code there is, right? But yeah, by the way, I am not showing you how to refactor for best practices. I'm just showing you how to get your code to compile the same on Puppet 4. Sometimes that's the biggest hurdle.
Right, and if doing that refactor would push out the time frame to start upgrading, I would definitely start upgrading first and then refactor afterwards.
Yeah, agreed. Any other questions? One in the back there.
I think we're actually out of time,
That's time.
but if you
All
have
right.
more questions, you can feel free to come up and talk to them afterward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.